Hello and welcome back to Parley. This one's paid for by True Mr. Food. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's on a subject the past few of their parlays have been about, what we've been calling the invisible wall, and this one is about creating emotional peaks in art. Quick drive-by refresher if you've been following along with these, but it's just been a bit, and so to refresh you, we're talking about this idea that in art there are works you could make, but there's a kind of invisible barrier that separates what people generally make from what you could make, and which there might be a good reason to make, but there's some reason why people would hesitate there. Things like maybe there are moral objections to the subject matter, or you have to push the people making the artwork kind of further than we agree is worth it to make the piece. Things like that. These are works that are physically possible. They're just improbable because of what it would take for them to logistically exist, if that makes sense. Mr. Food says, hello, hope you're doing well. This month we'll continue in our quest for the invisible wall. We'll try to move away from the author-audience relationship, which previous parlays were about, and observe a different part of the wall. I'd like to go back to the original quote, I sense that there must be a lot of emotional peaks that are possible on the other side of that invisible wall, unquote. That's by the guy who made Nier Automata. The name is escaping me, right? Anyway, it was in the first parlay. Mr. Foot continues, I like the term emotional peak here, but how does one go about in creating an emotional peak? I would argue that there are two effective approaches, which we're going to call the empathic and the experiential approaches. I'm not sure if there are better terms people discussing literature use. We're just going to use my own terms. Yep, cool. I think those are good names. Number one, the empathic approach. Humans are capable of empathy, and that expands to people who aren't real, like characters in stories. If a character experiences intense joy or hardships, we can empathize and live through them, sharing the emotional peak. Pretty simple. This is sort of the most common idea of a piece of work making you feel something. You see something sad in the work, and you might cry because you're sort of copying the sadness. Lightning quick empathy refresher. Sometimes I worry that, not really you, Mr. Food, but sometimes I worry that people feel like empathy is getting thrown around too much. We're just talking about the human ability to kind of copy an emotional response. You see a human, or maybe not even a human, having an emotional experience, and you can kind of, maybe we'll say photocopy and have a similar experience, the prompt of which isn't an event that happened to you exactly. You just kind of witnessed something happening to someone else, and you sort of feel a similar thing. For this situation, that's how we're defining empathy. And number two, the experiential approach. There's also the more complex approach of forcing the audience to experience the same thing the characters experience. This is usually done through some meta level, in addition to the empathic approach. The act of interacting with the piece of art becomes a sort of metaphor for what the character is experiencing. Interesting. This way, the emotional peaks are more real. I will follow up with some examples and notes, but first I'd like to establish my greater thesis for this topic. All things being equal, the emotional peaks from the experiential approach will always be higher than those produced in the empathic approach. The problem is things are rarely equal, and it requires a perfect storm of audience mindset, solid purpose, and good execution to match and outdo the empathic approach. What are your thoughts on these two approaches? Is the experiential approach the superior one, or should we stick to the empathic approach at all times? And of course, and you knew this when you wrote it, you're trying to get me to say, obviously they have strengths and weaknesses, as you paired out. Mr. Food's thesis is that the experiential approach has a higher ceiling, but the skill requirement is very high. The floor is very high. You can much more easily achieve the empathic approach, and so we can talk a little bit about, among other things, how much better the experiential approach really is when it's being more effective. And so is it really worth the trouble? Like if it's not much more effective at best than the empathic approach, but it just takes a ton of effort, what really is the point? I think there is a point, but I kind of agree with that point though. I think the experiential approach is clearly, it's a harder thing to do, and you would imagine it usually has more impact on people, but how much more though? And to what extent is that worth it? There are some examples that I want to include, but first I would just like to talk a little bit about some more simple trade-offs between the empathic and experiential approaches. So again, just to solidify these concepts in your mind, because we're going to use them a lot in this parlay. The empathic approach is this thing we're talking about where you watch a movie, or you're playing a video game and you see someone have a sad experience, and it's just you also maybe feel sad, or someone does something badass in a show and you go, yeah, that was sick. And there's a little bit of that feeling as well. That's not just excitement. I think there's a feeling of like shared triumph. You sort of, with them, felt the success. Actually, the very first thing I want to mention is that I think the experiential approach, it might tip people up if we don't give an example. Another thing I wanted to establish is that a lot of media is like a little experiential. So here I think it's useful to distinguish that we're talking about a piece that really leans into it. Let me explain what I mean. Indiana Jones goes on a quest for the magical MacGuffin. I don't know. I have actually barely watched Indiana Jones movies, but there's some questing, right? And in the movie, sitting in the movie theater or on your couch or whatever, you watch Indy like go on the adventure. You sit there for hours and like kind of go on the adventure. It's not that immersive compared to what you could do if your entire goal was for it to be immersive, but neither is it the least immersive experience. Pieces might do this to different degrees. Do you see the characters like take a piss in the desert while in the tomb? That's actually a decently common trope, which adds a sense of atmosphere, like you really went on the trip. I remember this scene from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 3, where there's like a big to-do and conflict with a stand user, where the four main characters, like they're in the desert, they're in Egypt, they go to a bar or like a cafe and order 4 iced teas, and it's sweaty, and the condensation on the iced tea glasses, you can see you can't see that at all, the water coming off of the glass, and that adds a little bit of a feeling of immersion, like you were going on the trip. I would argue that that JoJo's as a series, that style, does include like a moderate amount of relative immersion. They're trying to make you feel like you are in the place. The events are not a supercut of the most exciting moments. JoJo's as a style is trying to make any moment an exciting moment. Very heavy on style. And so we get to kind of cash that in by seeing really mundane moments. That's a cool approach. But my point is that, yeah, like obviously you can immerse the person a bit more and cause it to feel like they, you get out of the movie theater after watching the Indiana Jones movie or whatever. And there is a bit of an experiential effect where it was somewhat long. And so you do kind of feel like you went on an adventure. A really simple example, maybe the best example now that I'm into this, would be something like watching all 3 of the Lord of the Rings movies back to back. Like it's long. And so there is a feeling like you a little bit went through the experience yourself that the Hobbits did, right? This is adding to probably the much stronger aspect of the movie where you kind of empathy copy some experience the Hobbits had that you definitely did not have. Feelings of loss, sadness, triumph, etc. You didn't do those things, but you're mostly having an empathy response copying them. You did, though, do something that is a little bit you having an experience that is not unrelated to the one they had, right? You sat down and watched movies for like 8 hours. I mean, it was like a whole day, If you haven't done that, again, I think that's a good example. A lot of people have probably done listening to this. But maybe it would be useful to have an example that really leans into, we're talking about going quite a bit further with the experiential approach, and Mr. Fruit has provided one, so let's use it. A simple example, Mr. Fruit says, of experiential storytelling in games, which I think are pretty good at this, just to frame the subject, is when you get a weapon that is ridiculously powerful, and you curb stomp every enemy in your path, riding on the high of the power fantasy. This is not just you empathizing with the character being powerful, but also you experiencing being powerful in the context of the game systems. The battering ram at the end of Bastion or the screw attack in Metroid games are good examples of this. Yes, so a great simple example. You are powerful. You're not just seeing that the character is kicking ass. The game was challenging you, and suddenly it isn't in the same way. You have a feeling like you yourself are actually exerting yourself less. Again, you can see how the Lord of the Rings marathon is like a very mini version of this, but video games give you much more dramatic versions of that feeling. Video games as a medium, this is a major strength of video games storytelling. It's not very hard to give the audience a much larger experiential experience than almost all other media without trying that hard. That will definitely be a pro and con of the empathic experiential thing. But I think it was useful to really lead with an example because for some people it might be difficult to imagine, what do you mean? Also, later, I'm going to be making a point that I think there's kind of a third, maybe, approach, perhaps a little bit more theoretical. I really had difficulty thinking of examples, and I gave it a couple of days, too. I asked a few people. I really had difficulty coming up with examples. But I do think there is a more meta approach that is meaningfully different from the experiential approach. I think a key that I'll come back to later, but it's useful now, too, for the experiential approach, is that you are often experiencing something that is happening to the characters. Mr. Foot added, it's usually in addition to the empathy experience. I agree. I think a key thing about the experiential approach is usually it's just you are doing, to some extent, a thing that the characters are doing in the piece of media. One example from a previous parlay is how in The Rehearsal, a show about helping people through things they're anxious to confront in their life by painstakingly replicating those scenarios. There's a subplot where it becomes a little difficult for the people involved in the show or the show's production, that's not entirely clear, but that's sort of the point, to tell when something is or isn't real in their lives. This is a spoiler, but there is so you can skip a minute if you don't want a spoiler for The Rehearsal. But we talked about it in the previous parlays. So where a child participating in one of the rehearsals, it may not be entirely clear that the person he's acting as a child to isn't his dad. It's not entirely clear because this is a young child exactly what they think is going on. You see what I mean? There's a good line where our focus character asks, does he understand what acting is? Which is just a terrifying line in a certain way. But you see the point, right? And so we as the audience have, I think, a stronger than usual for a visual medium that you don't interact with experience, where we are wondering along with the characters what things are real. And I think another thing that distinguishes experiential experiences, things that are doing the experiential approach, is that our experience is quite similar to, but a little desynced with the character. So for example, in a video game, you have some outside awareness that, wow, this ability is really overpowered. Is this like a shift in the game mechanics, which isn't probably something the characters in the game are thinking, right? Your experience is very similar, but not exactly the same. I think that also distinguishes it from the empathy thing. It really is your experience. You are generating a new emotion. You are not photocopying one. Now, Mr. Food, again, your thesis is that this is always a higher emotional peak. Yeah, I mean, I guess the obvious reason to think that would be that you are having the experience yourself. It is more similar to if you did the thing on your own. I think we can agree that if you went on the journey of the plot of The Lord of the Rings, that would have more impact on you than if you watched the movie. Almost certainly, though we'll get back to that. And so the experiential approach is like a step in that direction. Maybe. Well, I think a major advantage of the empathic approach is that you get people when they're relaxed. The very fact that it's less effective and direct allows you to change people in a way that I think most people are much more susceptible to. To explain, you may have meant this when you said that the experiential approach requires, a perfect storm of audience mindset, solid purpose, and good execution. Why does it require a perfect storm, including audience mindset? Well, because I think that the experiential approach requires the audience member to be a little less defensive, if that makes sense, or willing to have the experience. Watching The Hobbit, you kind of, and the Lord of the Rings movies, I mean, the hobbits in the Lord of the Rings movies, go on the journey, you need to be, you know, up for watching the movies for 6 hours. So while you've added immersion, perhaps, you also ask more of the audience, which I have experienced many times. Most people are not willing to put effort into actively changing. Indeed, the reason that people don't change more in their lives is because it is scary. It is insecurity inducing. Like, you have to be very vulnerable. It doesn't feel good. Life kind of sucks a lot of the time. You don't want to use your leisure time to feel vulnerable. Well, speaking for myself, actually, I do that very often. But I understand, because I do it, exactly why people don't, and it's because it is hard. It doesn't feel good at first. You have to be convinced that the payoff is worth it. And so I think that the very fact that the empathic approach doesn't push as hard is a better way to change. Yeah, but only people that don't want to change that much. Is that entirely fair? But I do think it's true. By the very fact that it is less of a direct change, you can change most people the way it's more effective to change them, which is a sort of erosion of their current perspective, very, very gradually across many instances. Of course, most people don't change much over the course of their lives at all, in my opinion, in the grand scheme of things, compared to how much you could. And so I'm not sure that this is doing much, and maybe that's because all the little erosions in different directions are not combined. The riverbed does not get worn down in the same direction, it gets worn down more evenly by a variety of different messages. So if you really wanted to affect people in some way, you might need something stronger, even if you have to settle with the fact that it won't fire for as many people. I'm not sure I agree with that, but if someone were to say that's why I'm not willing to go, gentler with changing people, sure, maybe. As a side note, I think, it's worth noting that what I'm pairing out there is that changing someone very gently or extremely harshly, that is, you literally make people go on the adventure depicted in The Lord of the Rings, those both work really well for most people. You can literally force them, but not usually with a piece of art. Or you can do the kind of the gentlest version where you still depict emotions. But the one in the middle, where you kind of push on them and try to get them to have the experience themselves, there's some resistance. And that will go on to be true of my suggested third meta approach. I wanted to read a few more of the examples you provided. But a related point about this is, Mr. Fruit, you said the biggest problem of the experiential approach, you think, is that people don't usually experience the way a story is told as part of the story, rather viewing it as an annoyance. Well, not always, I don't think, but yes, I know what you mean. So, for example, most people wouldn't think of The Lord of the Rings being long as part of the story. That's like, I'd like to have the experience of watching it with someone or whatever, but I don't want to need to be tired at the end. Yeah? Mr. Fruit, you actually included something, you headed off something you knew I was going to say, because I always bring it up about this subject. You said, I'm expecting you to mention the experiential storytelling, if you can call it that, of Moby Dick. I haven't read it, so I can't comment on it. All I'll say is that maybe the problem here is that the experiential elements don't really serve any emotional peak. Yeah, I think that's a good take. There's a lot of things to criticize about Moby Dick, in my humble opinion. The thing I don't like about it, to catch you up and reframe for this parlay, is that Moby Dick is a piece that wants you to have the experiential approach of going on a whaling voyage. The author does this by making reading the book as close to the experience of going on a whaling voyage as possible, with essentially no artistic license taken on many points. I don't think that Herman Melville is a bad writer. That's not what I'm saying. But many chapters are, like, written in text form, exactly and unabridged only the thing you would experience on a whaling voyage. I would argue that this is not storytelling. That is not storytelling. That is more like a documentary, in my opinion. That's okay. I'm just saying it's not a good story, because it literally isn't a story at many points. It's just like, there's a whole chapter that is essentially Wikipedia articles about whales. There isn't, in my opinion, really storytelling happening here, at least not experiential storytelling. There is an experiential mechanic occurring where, yeah, like I imagine Melville wants to make you feel like you went on the journey. I just think that's ineffective. Sure, it might be more effective if it was to make you feel an emotional peak instead of literally just having the experience. To put it a different way, why are you trying to get people to have an experience that is an experience that is neither here nor there emotionally? You know what I mean? Like, I'm not entirely convinced that does anything other than just imparting the knowledge. And indeed, that one chapter is basically a Wikipedia article about what, I don't know. It's weird, is my point. Yes, I think that's a good example. I'm happy you brought it up. Them being in service of an emotional peak is key, not only because it just feels pointless otherwise, in my humble opinion. That might just be me. But also because, yeah, another key aspect of this experiential approach is that people might resist the change. A lot of our discussion about this, we're going to have to include that it is an experiential approach in service of an emotional peak. You could use experiential storytelling to do things that are not emotional peaks, but that's what we're talking about. Mr. Vu, one more example I thought was useful. A non-game example of this is Bad Flower, She Knows, which is a music lyric video. A song about the end of a relationship that goes on for longer than it has to, only to end abruptly. Critically, this applies to both the story being told and the song itself. This leaves one confused and lost with a, is this how it's supposed to be? That's pretty fitting for the relationship described in that song, and way more effective than anything the singer could say to make us empathize. If it works for the audience. As Mr. Food says, people might not interpret that as being part of the message. They might just think this song was written in a format which I dislike, and they may not notice that the song is written in a form that mirrors the experiences in the song. That's a particularly good example of that important point, so I wanted to include it. Yes, extremely useful. Right, so I think now is a good time to introduce my third thing, but I just wanted to summarize that I think a big advantage of the empathic approach that makes it perhaps decisively the victor of the two, compared to the experiential approach, is that the empathic approach is a largely more agreeable way to change most people. I feel this is somewhat unfair in a way. It's like saying that it's more effective against less effective people. That seems a little unfair. I feel like the experiential approach should still get credit for being a good way to change people that want to change. Like, that's not pointless, right? But maybe it's useful to say that you wouldn't expect the experiential approach to be popular. You would expect to find the experiential approach in media that was a little more niche, where people are already invested in going on whatever journey the piece has in mind. Therefore, they probably won't push back against an experiential aspect to the piece of work, and it'll probably work, which I think is something that artists think about. Therefore, you would expect them to go for that approach more often. I don't know how much more in more niche media. I would like to add a little side excursion that maybe this is often conflated, though, with people being a little highfalutin about their media. So the experiential approach, it sounds like more work. You know, when people go to an art museum or something, and I've had the experience of having no learning or study on abstract art, going into a gallery room with abstract art in it and thinking, I have difficulty accepting that this is meaningful, like that there is anything here. I once had a partner for a little while who we went to museums on dates a lot. And she seemed so sold that, there was meaning in this piece. Now, let's be real that it could just be she's full of garbage. No offense, previous partner, but we need to acknowledge that you may not really be seeing anything there that isn't coming from you. It's not absolutely necessary that abstract art has to be deep. It could be shallow. Like, there could just be no real meaning there that can be universalized and interpreted by a meaningful amount of the population. That is possible, or at least it seems possible from my uninformed perspective. But it's much more likely that there is meaning there that I just don't get it, right? Of course. She probably knows what she's talking about, and I just don't. That's the much more likely interpretation. I said as much at the time, I feel that way now. But it is worth considering, well, it sure would make people feel like they were having the experience of consuming an experiential piece that was meaningful. If they had to put in effort, it allows them the defense. If they are a snob, unlike this person I'm using as an example, if they just say, well, you don't get it. If you're not versed in wine tasting, you don't know whether wines have meaningfully different taste characteristics. You cannot know that, well, for yourself anyway. I think that we should just take wine tasters at their word, that it's like not fake, though some of it's fake. You see what I mean? And so I think it's also worth mentioning that the experiential approach is a real meaningful pitfall that by going deeper on the subject in a direct way and trying to make it feel like something where you've had an experience, people are going to hold that up and make something sound deep, even if it isn't, I think. And it is in this context that I would like to introduce my third approach, potentially. And I'm going to call this one the metatextual approach. This is an experience in which the audience is made to go through an experience because of the piece. It's not only empathy, but the experience that they're going through because of the piece is not directly a subject of the piece. It is an intended almost byproduct or side effect, but a very intended is a vague term here, but I mean a very, very structured, distinct side effect. I say metatextual because I think the simplest version of this type of experience would be something like Haruki Murakami's Hard-Boiled Wonderland and the End of the World. This book has two kind of parts that alternate chapters. There is, if you like, two stories contained in the book. There are two stories in the book, and they flip-flop each chapter. Even chapters are one, odd chapters are the other. Now, one of them, without really explaining much about the story, you should read it, I thought it was fun, is kind of a cyberpunk, a little bit dystopian experience that is fairly rooted in reality, but like future, kind of weird, fairly technical reality. And the other half is a very surreal, where exactly is everything grounded in this world, sort of limbo land type of story. Quite a different tone, right? And something that happens when you read this story is if you read one of the chapters of Hard-Boiled Wonderland, the odd chapters, if you like, and then you read a chapter of The End of the World, the even chapters, and the book is set up this way, you always read one chapter after the other, you get a kind of flavor saver thing in your mouth where, like, on the tip of your tongue, in the neurons of your brain, there is still this encoding to perceive a world that is the kind of light cyberpunk hard-boiled wonderland kind of world. It's hard to define the genre, by the way. It is very light cyberpunkiness. It's quite difficult to nail down exactly what it is, but it is a more grounded, more technical style. And then you read The End of the World, which is a little bit more abstract and floaty. They bring out notes of each other. Some of that is in pretty obvious ways, but I personally think that the way that you are made to doubt reality in some parts of the story, without spoiling too much, is beyond exactly the experiential approach. You are not having an experience that is directly evoked by any events in the story. It's just sort of something that is reliably caused by consuming the story, but which isn't very directly related to the story. Maybe it would help to give a different example. So in video games, I would imagine this would be something like, what's that game called? Man, where you... Oh man, I'm gonna have to find it in my list of games, but I think, did you recommend this, Mr. Food? Post Void. Post Void is so it's kind of a shooter kind of a speedrunny shooter. And the thing about the game is that the rhythm of the game and the way you have to fight enemies and behave in the game causes you to become different for a little bit if you get into the game a little bit. It affects in you a certain haste and aggression with a tactical note that isn't provoked by a lot of games. The game makes you feel weak and it almost encourages you to die in a bizarre way that isn't quite like a lot of other games, at least that I've experienced. Now, the problem with this metatextual approach to me is that many of the examples I'm able to produce for you seem ultimately rooted in our current experience. Like they're only that way because you haven't had the experience of games like this that much. But here's the thing. You won't have the experience of these types of things that much. That's what's key to me. I think what's different for these is that they are brushing up against the invisible wall. They are a type of experience that kind of breaks you on purpose. Like in Post Void, you respawn. You can try again really quick. Like industry-leading respawn time, right? Because the game knows you're gonna die. The game is trying to get you to run to your death. Like, you're going to die a ton very fast and then need to restart over and over and over and over again. You know, this phenomenon with this game, Steam says I played this game for 84 minutes. It feels like it was a lot longer than that, quite a bit longer than that. I would have guessed maybe 3 or 4 hours if you had pressed me. Don't know how I feel about that. Anyway, and I feel like I got further in that game than maybe I did. I don't think I did. So to summarize, again, like the empathic and experiential approaches are close, I think that this, my proposed metatextual experience or approach to creating an emotional peak or reaction is also a bit of a gray area. You know, it's not dissimilar to the experiential approach, but I think there's a degree that moves away from that approach in which it moves toward the invisible wall. I think that there's an interesting way in which you can get a game to kind of intentionally fiddle with someone while providing quality of life to them while doing so. So you see what I mean? Like, it's not as if Post Void is just a game that makes you die a lot and that changes your perception because it's annoying. It's a game that is trying to cater to you and get you comfortable in an intentionally unpleasant headspace for a little bit and create a kind of gameplay loop there where you sort of practice thinking a way that is not normal to you. The metatextual approach I'm billing is the most similar to if you just had the experience in real life and nobody intended it. You simply played an arcade cabinet and you were really bad at arcade games or something and it was really hard or it was broken or whatever. And you began thinking in a different way because you just needed to beat the arcade cabinet because your lover died there in 1968. Nobody intended this. You would become a different person to some extent from having that experience. You would have to become a slightly different person. But the arcade game in and of itself only vaguely prompted that change. Yet the change was predictable given the situation. You see what I mean? Most people would have a similar type of change happen to them from going through that experience. Yet it isn't very directly depicted by anything in the text, which is why I say metatextual. I think this is an example of, like, if you go a little further, this is pretty much in the rehearsal show category where you are very directly manipulating people into having an experience. The experience is almost fake, I would say. It's touching up against that. It's touching up against kind of manipulating people for no clear purpose. You know, why are you having this experience this way? I think an interesting note about the empathic and experiential approaches is that if the experience is unpleasant enough, that is the change not good-willed enough, you'll, stop consuming the media, and those changes won't succeed much. But this approach, this metatextual approach, could be sneakier in a way. There's something about it that kind of breaks you a little bit in a way that you may not entirely have signed up for. It's kind of like a white lie almost at worst. A lot of internet communication is this. Anyway, not to go on about it too much. But I think this is worth considering. You know, your ultimate question was, how do you go about creating an emotional peak? And I think that the one that toes near the invisible wall is where the experience has a Machiavellian scheme for the player compared to simply depicting feelings it would like to share with the player. In a video game, which is, I guess, where my brain has locked onto now, the empathic approach is uncommon. And so I think in video games, when you're kind of deciding that the player needs to do something, you would think there'd be a lot more awareness of this subject. I think the interesting thing is that there isn't in practice, in my experience. I think a lot of games are not made by people who think about the player playing the game that much relative to how much it is obvious to, given that you are making something people have to do. When you make a tool to be good in real life, you're thinking about what makes it easy to use. What else would you think about? But when people make a video game, I think they might often retreat to the more comfortable ground of thinking about what is being depicted by the game, not what the player is experiencing the game as. This is also probably just harder. It's just more difficult to do that well. A simple manifestation of this problem is that a lot of games' user experience is really bad. The way the game depicts the things in the game makes sense enough, but the way you operate the game to get through to them is mired in delays that really break the experience, which are, if not unknown to the developer, they're unacknowledged, or they weren't given, I would argue, the proper weight by the developer. If the experience is about immersively exploring an open world, Genshin Impact has a new region that just updated. And now in the open world, you can interact with things using the different elements that your characters have. But you can only have 4 characters on a team at once, and there are 7 elements, and the environment uses a variety of them a lot. It is hard to have all of the stuff the game is going to ask of you on your team, and there are benefits to not putting a variety of elements on your team. Well, as much of a variety, which causes you to repeatedly switch characters. But that process specifically is quite a stop in the exploration. It's quite slow. I would argue that is among the most important things Genshin Impact could have gotten right. The game's biggest focus compared to its peers, the open world, and the sort of biggest strength of the gameplay, interacting with that world and the combat system or ability system, has perhaps the game's most glaring and obvious bad quality of life. That just can't be much else other than the developers not really thinking about the game as experientially as it just is an experiential experience. Maybe that's an interesting way to put it as well. You kind of sign up for the game being pretty experiential by making a video game. You could make games that are less or more experiential, of course, but I mean, the player will need to experience it to some degree, right? So I don't know. I mean, I think that in and of itself is an interesting point. You could argue, just like I did earlier in this parlay, that because people are more comfortable with the empathic approach, people don't push boundaries in video games in a way that people are not as shy about pushing boundaries in other media, because it's uniquely uncomfortable for the audience. You need to live yourself the experiences in the game more than in other types of media inherently, and so it makes sense in a way to retreat to the empathic approach that people are more comfortable with, which is the cause of people like me who want the experiential thing getting frustrated. Like, why are you so afraid to do anything new or anything at all in the game design? You know, maybe there is a surprisingly good, there's a reason for it, to be doing things that way. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I almost feel like the invisible wall thing, the most important detail is just how much you lean on that question about what work is it worth to improve oneself. I'm going to tell you a little anecdote before I conclude. I have been thinking a lot in my I'm 30 years old life about how people are kind of locking in, a lot of people in my perception circle, not a lot of close friends of mine. But my partner, for example, has been talking recently. A lot of my friends are getting married and moving into a house or whatever. And I don't want that. And it makes me anxious that other people are doing that, she says. And I've been saying, well, it's hard because while I don't think they took enough time to evaluate whether that was a good choice, I don't think they will take enough time to evaluate whether that's a good choice. So, is there a point in saying you should get to know your partner better before committing? Well, I don't know. I mean, this is relatively good for them, I guess. I don't know. I mean, to me, it doesn't seem that way. So, maybe I'm a bit judgmental about other people's relationships, okay? And I think it's the same thing here. If the ultimate thing you're doing is provoking an emotional peak, almost want to say that because the peak is so low for a lot of people, any discussion about approaching an invisible wall that is the barrier of how high you can go is just kind of doomed to fail or irrelevant to a lot of people. And so, in the first place, it might be worth reframing this discussion around people who we can assume want to work for that emotional peak. And instead of trying to interpret the invisible wall as something that applies to a lot of people, because it just doesn't, I think, it might be better to think about where the most down to pursue change, expletive, the most down to get it down person for getting emotional peaks. What point would that person think the invisible wall was at? At what point is the invisible wall making something like objectively not worth it? Like there just is no conceivable reapable reward by any sane person rather than, where do most people just, not deal with it anymore? I don't know. To me, that has become kind of a distraction. I guess that's my response overall. I think the experiential approach has a lot fewer drawbacks when you look at it this way, right? The perfect storm of audience mindset, solid purpose, and good execution. You could argue that when people aren't perfect storming, the empathic approach has little net effect as well. I said toward the beginning of the parlay, like wearing down a bed in a river. If the empathic approach is a lighter thing, but less focused, and the person just has a lot of them, I'm not sure it produces any significant overall change. I would argue that the sort of default perspective in our society is all those empathic approaches kind of averaging out. Not everyone consumes all media, but most people consume mostly more popular media. Most people have more friends, your friends have more friends than you do. That whole thing. And so, because of that, that's just averaging out. You could argue then that the empathic approach almost always has no effect, no real effect, because the very fact that people are only willing to experience the more limited empathic change inherently nullifies its effect through averaging. And therefore, the experiential approach wins by default, no contest. My metatextual approach, is automatically catapulted to viability simply because you cannot change people any meaningful amount any other way. It just isn't enough. Unless the person is already so willing to change that the experiential approach is validated. If someone is more willing to change, it's going to be easier to get them to sign up for more of an experience and give the work the benefit of the doubt and invest in the story a little bit more. And therefore, the disadvantage of the experiential approach vanishes if the person is at all relevant to this discussion. Is this overly judgmental to other people's ability to change? I don't think so. It's not because they're inept. It's because change is reckless and hard and scary, and people are busy and not always as privileged to just waffle about this subject for 45 minutes like I just did. So thank you for privileging me to waffle about this subject for 45 minutes. I hope you enjoyed yourself. Hope whatever this was accompanying went well. You want to get your own parlay like this, there's a link in the description. Looking forward to your next one, Mr. Food. This has been a fun series. I hope you felt I took this in a useful direction. I added that little bit at the end because since you've said you want to do a lot of these, it seems good to have a mind toward the next ones by a little bit more. We're trying to further a long-term discussion topic, so it seems important to put effort into the subject overall, not just the specific parlay. I hope you feel I did okay at that. Talk to you soon.